and Boo happened to be there. Now, Boo was the jumps coach. I think sat in on my talk. I ended up speaking to him afterwards. I asked him about, hey, what's the deal? Can I come down here and coach sprints? He's like, oh, that don't worry about that. Come work for me. So I'm like ecstatic about this.
Mike Young, welcome to the podcast. Before I get into your background, your accomplishments, everything you've done so far, which I'm super excited to do, to give some context and everything, thank you for joining. How are you doing today? And tell me some good that's going on in your life.
Well, thanks for having me, first of all. Always a great opportunity to be on a podcast like yours. Everything's good right now. Unfortunately, I'd like to be playing still with my soccer club, but we got eliminated in the playoffs. But that does mean that I can take care of some things that had been put on the back burner for some time. And that's kind of the story of my life. Always kind of trying to take a breath a little bit, dabbling dabbling between the fine line of drowning and taking a breath. Yeah, everything's good.
Aren't we all? And hopefully a little bit earlier workouts in the day than when you're rocking and rolling with everything that you have going on. So fingers crossed for that. But so Mike is the director of performance and sports sciences at Athletic Lab in North Carolina, staff of 11. He's spoken all over the world as the performance director of the North Carolina Courage, which is the NWSL team, has consulted similar performance director type roles in the MLS, USL, European soccer teams, has some Olympic lifting medals himself, has his own coaching academy, which we will discuss. I have 7 super exciting questions that we're going to get into today. So I guess the first one, not on my list, is how do you do it all? As I was just scrolling through your website, just like doing my homework, I was just like, oh my gosh, does this guy not sleep?
So well, that's part of it actually. I have a almost certainly a genetic predisposition to be a night owl and a short sleep gene, which is that combination is probably about 2 to 3% of the population. So I have a long history of, staying up very, very late. In the past, prior to me kind of taming it down or toning it down a little bit, it was 3 a.m. to 3 a.m. to 8 a.m. would be my sleep, and waking up feeling pretty good. So lately, I've kind of upped that a little bit, tried to get around 6 hours of sleep
Yeah,
and a
treat
little bit
yourself. Six
better
hours.
better time frame, a little better time frame. But it takes a lot of interventions to do that. But I enjoy what I do. I have kind of these qualities, for better or worse, that have allowed me to effectively work double sometimes. It's a blessing and a curse because it's not always great to do that. I'm not trying to romanticize it or anything like that. It's not like it's great for personal relationships all the time or work-life balance, but I do enjoy what I do. I don't probably feel burnout like a lot of individuals might. But yeah, that is kind of how I've rolled since as long as I can remember. My dad had similar qualities where he's stay up late, wake up early, don't sleep very much. And the combination of liking what you do has kind of led to, yeah, try to dabble in many different areas.
I myself also have the night owl gene, but I don't have the short sleep gene, so it's a weird, challenge that I have. But
Yeah, that
my prime time is like, 10 p.m. to 1 a.m. or so. It's just
I'm the
everyone
same.
else is asleep. It's just, yeah, that's when I get cooking for sure. Um, so the connection, well, first, Mike Young is one of those names, at least in the coaching tree that I come from, was one of the first few names to follow when I got in back in 2016. So super small world to have someone that I followed for so long, to have them on the pod. And our connection to this pod was John Grace 2 or 3 episodes ago, who shared some crazy stories about, following you up to Canada, and then just like how the happenstance of how we got to intern at Athletic Lab and stuff. But first, could you guess? I'm assuming you haven't listened to the episode. Can you guess what John said for his craziest story from his career? And it has to do with Athletic Lab. I'll give you a hint.
So I did see some of the highlights, and I do have it on my downloaded list to listen to, but I have not listened to the whole podcast. So this is a little bit cheating, but I'm guessing it's when John Cena came in to train him and the whole WWE crew were in the town, and we've had a handful of scenarios like that at Athletic Lab over the years where you just meet some amazing people doing amazing things. Some of them are athletes, some of them are actors or musicians, and that was a pretty wild one. John actually got to do power cleans with John Cena,
Yeah.
um, and I've got a picture next to John Cena where I look like a little munchkin standing next to Cena, or actually have picture evidence of the man you can't see. And it was cool little setup here. In the early days, we would have stuff like that happen, which we really didn't even deserve the right to have things like that happen, but it did. So pretty cool.
So for opportunities like that, trying to guess how that would materialize. So there's three things that I think could happen, and then fill me in on how John Cena lifting your facility kind of came to be. So it could either be they just stroll in one day and are like, "Hey, can we lift?" It's either like a common connection of someone that you had from way back when who knew John Cena that kind of referred you, or someone on, let's say, John Cena's team was just like, "We'll be an NC. Let's just like do our homework online," and like you just get an email and you're like almost hit spam and you're like, all right, I might as well respond. It could be John Cena. So like, how did that just come to be? Fit is an online programming software that helps you train more athletes in less time with greater individualization. For in-person or remote training, Fit does so with a streamlined programming process, decision-making trees to help you integrate data into your programming, as well as better communication with all pieces of a high-performance model involved to break down silos. Learn more at fit.io, that's fytt.io, and tell them that Matt Tometz sent you.
So it was probably closer to the last one. I have no connections in the WWE, but I'm guessing that they looked us up, looked for performance training centers. Those guys are true athletes. They train like athletes. They needed open space. They needed bumper plates. Mind you, this is probably around 2013, 14, I'm guessing. And, so your options at that point in time would largely be like CrossFit kind of gyms to have bumpers and everything else like that. There weren't as many functional strength and conditioning type of facilities, especially the sizes that we were. So I'm guessing that's how it came about. And it was, as I said, it was a couple of them that came in. There was probably over 2 or 3 visits. There were probably about 12, 15 guys. One guy comes in and we kept facility records at the time. One guy comes in, he had been a former power lifter, elite level, and he comes in and he reps out like 800-pound power lift or 800-pound deadlift for like 10 reps without even really warming up. I mean, these guys are monsters. John Cena's blowing out the facility power clean record. Another guy breaks the deadlift record by so great a margin that we subsequently had to like eliminate that off the books because it could never be broken. But yeah, it was really cool. Really cool.
Fantastic. Very, very cool, kind of just story and everything. And when John told me that, I was just like, that sounds like it was literally out of a movie. Just walking in John Cena's right there, and probably fits the 3 standard deviation outlier for, not including them in your record analysis and stuff for sure. So consequently, let's kick it off with your coolest, craziest story from your career so far. A little bit longer than John's, a little bit more international and stuff. So if you had to kind of pull one story out of your back pocket at like a party, kind of just summarizing everything you've done, which one comes to mind?
So this probably isn't as sexy or as exciting as John Cena. It's probably a little bit longer in the buildup. But for me personally, what I would say is one that I kind of hold near and dear to my heart is that when I made the decision to kind of take a step forward and start the business, move to North Carolina blindly, I thought I had a facility lined up. A company was going to bring me in and run this privatized sport performance training center, let me do everything. And it ended up falling through. Magnificent building, it falls through. I end up having to search for a facility because now I was all in on North Carolina. I'm looking for places where I could start the business. I'm bouncing around at other little locations. One of them was a former Velocity Sports Performance in an orthopedic location. I went there and met with them, and I distinctly remember they were like, "What do we need you for? We run our own ship here. We're doing our own thing." And I was like, okay, didn't really take it too personally, but I did remember it. And then we end up finding a place, starting the business, really humble origins. John Grace was actually with us for much of our early days. And we end up moving into another place and expanding 4 or 5 years down the line. uh, that Velocity Sports Performance had turned into an Exos. Exos was at the time making some moves to try to open up Exos locations outside of their Phoenix and LA location, and they actually put two in Raleigh, in the Raleigh Triangle area. The first one was in that location where they had just kind of poo-pooed me because they were not doing so well. So 5 years on, they had kind of shooed me away, and they'd had to go on this venture for Exos. Um, they then opened another location in the place that I was supposed to move into. So when I first moved down here, so that place was actually at this point in time about a quarter mile away from my current location. So
Oh
this is
man.
like watching a dog, your neighbor's dog, come up and take a shit in your lawn. Um, that is one case where I actually did take it a little personal. So they opened,
Oh,
and
of
there's
course.
two Exos. They open one, their business failed. They open the Exos, then they take over this other spot and open another Exos. And mind you, Exos is like a world leading institution in terms of performance, especially at the time. A couple years passed, both go out of business. They're asking me to take over the space that the Exos has now vacated. They have to move out of the Exos that's in our backyard, and then they become tenants of ours. So it became a little bit of like
How the turns have tabled.
just a winning story, right?
Yeah,
Exactly,
yeah.
and a David versus Goliath kind of thing. So uh, all that transpired over about a 12 to 15 year time span. And to kind of bookend that, when that first facility fell through, I got wind of this sporting complex that was going to be built in this area, the Triangle area of North Carolina, a very growing, burgeoning area. And it was, two or three hockey rinks, couple soccer fields, uh, volleyball courts, sport performance. It was really designed, or the planning of it was designed like really ambitious. And I looked at that and I was like, well, that's going to take a couple years before they open something like that. It's not going to stop me from opening my business. They got delayed in opening all of that. What was supposed to be a 2 to 3 year project ended up being about 15 years. And then I became the sport performance provider. I opened up Athletic Lab in this new location that had seemed like a dream slash competitor when we first moved to the area. So kind of things came full circle. Maybe winning out over some of our competitors, things that looked like a dream actually became reality. So kind of cool in retrospect. A lot of things that I don't take for granted, people I don't take for granted along the way that just kind of brought us to where we are now.
I think that's a perfect kind of epitome of probably every field, but S&C is so niche that like 5 years later, some random guy comes in your facility, you're like, kind of rude to him, and then like, you know, now he's your landlord, So um that's why it's like just always be nice because you never know who knows who. And whether it's I have so many of my own stories or people on the podcast of just like, oh yeah, I ran into this person or this person that came back around, well, they gave me someone or I meet John Grace through someone who I was doing some kind of like collaboration with, and then like this guy that I've been following for 8 years on social media, consuming his stuff is like now on my Zoom in my living room. Um, so what like coaches, this podcast is sponsored by Samson Equipment. They've been providing elite strength training equipment and professional weight room solutions since 1976. If you value quality products, great customer service, and a company with integrity, then make Samson Equipment your go-to. Visit them at samsonequipment.com. That's SAMSON Equipment. And let them know that Matt Tometz sent you. ISOFIT is not just pioneering isometric strength training, but they are opening up a brand new world of possibilities with health and performance benefits through isometric training and their own groundbreaking product. With patented force matching technology, they're reshaping the boundaries of functional health and human performance. Discover the future of health, fitness, and sports performance at isofit.com. That's ISOPHIT.com, and tell them that Matt Tillman sent you. In the business journey and facility, location finding and leases and sublets and kind of all those things, Did you have a businessy background? Did you have someone like a consultant? Did you have an actual kind of like Eric Cressey Pete Dupuis thing, or like navigating some of those
Not at all.
things?
I was, yeah,
All
I
you, all
was
solo?
really all solo, very blind to all of that, very naive to what was really necessary. I think Eric Cressey was probably a year or two before me. Mike Boyle is probably the great grandfather of the field, doing it solo without like any VC kind of capitalist fund, capital venture, capital funding, that kind of thing. Obviously, Mark Verstegen was, one of the first to launch a big facility. I think he had some kind of corporate backing as well. But Mike Boyle, Eric Cressey, they were probably Zach Evanesh. These are guys that are like right around the same time as me. In some cases, maybe a year earlier, 2 years earlier. But basically, this is kind of a nascent field in terms of sport performance, especially the boutique type of setting. There had been Velocity Sports Performance and Frappier Sports Performance, which has since been renamed to Athletic Republic. But there hadn't really been too many successful kind of boutique single owner, um, sport performance, strength and conditioning centers. I really didn't have too much of an idea what I was doing, but thankfully I also didn't know that I didn't know what I didn't know. So, our first year, we're not filing tax filings. Thankfully, we didn't make any money, so it didn't really matter. But
Hopefully the
there were no
IRS isn't
penalties or
listening
anything
to
like that.
this.
Well, I mean, we've since come clean on everything. John Grace is probably with his moving to Canada. That's probably the most trouble I could get into. But
Legally.
that's right. Right. But there were a handful of things where it was just I just didn't understand what was necessary in terms of the permits. And you walk into businesses and you think everything just operates normally. You don't realize that, hey, you got to buy toilet paper, you got to turn the lights on, you got to if somebody doesn't do it, you've got to do it.
Mm.
And the life of an owner of a business is very much like a parent, because at the end of the day, it's not the grandparents' job. It's not your aunt and uncle's job. It's the at the end of the day, it's ultimately comes down to you. You've got to take care of it when it hits the fan, or good or bad, or you got to pay people or not pay people, or it's you that don't get paid. It's you that has to come in on a Sunday. All of those things I wasn't really prepared for. So I didn't have a business background, kind of learned on the fly. Uh, One of the, I guess, best qualities that I might have among many not so great ones is that I'm a quick learner. So I'm not gonna fail repeatedly. I can tell
Mm.
you that, and I have a very positive mindset. Um, Almost fatally optimistic. I pretty much just don't think I can fail at anything. So it's not like I'm arrogant or conceited. It's just I'm going to put my head down and figure it out. And it doesn't really cross my mind too much that I'm going to fail. I kind of think like if I try to do something, I'm going to do it well and we're going to succeed. But it was obviously a massive risk, difficult on my family in terms of the sacrifices of time and finances and everything like that. I didn't really have a full idea of it. It's only 10, 15 years on where I kind of am very aware of the enormity of what we've done. Um, and more proud of it now that we can kind of step back. So yeah, it was kind of cool, but I didn't have that back. I didn't have a business background at all. My dad was an entrepreneur. Um, I was always a risk taker for sure, but I wasn't. I didn't. I was separated a bit from my dad. Didn't really grow up around this entrepreneurial business kind of setting, so it was all just learn it as you go. I used to say, build the plane as you fly it.
Mm.
And that's kind of how we ran the business early on.
It's a combination of, all those, psychological effects that all describe the same thing of like it's an uninformed optimism and you don't know what you don't know, where it's almost like there's that you get going and then things you should or shouldn't be doing. It's almost like paralysis by analysis just by accumulating more information about it all, and
Yeah, that's right.
depending on how familiar you are with Driveline Baseball and kind of their origin story, that's one that I'm a big fan of. I like Kyle Boddy. And he says, if his facility started 2 years earlier or later, so basically like a 4-year window, um, probably wouldn't have been what it is today and like literally revolutionizing baseball and all those things to where if that, mega facility had stayed on schedule, or if the building you leased out, someone had gotten in there like a year before you did. And it's just so crazy to look back at all those things. But you'll always be successful. It's just a matter of when, I guess, if I had to summarize that. So
Yeah, I
super
hope so.
super cool, crazy story on how it all comes full circle. And when people come back around for positive or for better or for worse, and just put yourself in the position to be on the better side of that for sure. So next, brought to you by 1080 Motion. They're here to make speed happen. I'm a big fan of those people at the company, big fan of the product, mostly the 1080 Sprint, a sponsor of this podcast. So what are 1 to 3 staples in your programs, just classics, as simple or complex as they may be? And of course, there's obviously different things between, athlete training age and sport and kind of things like that. But like, what are some of the few bread and butter kind of things that, like, in most of your programs, there's going to be some variation of these few things?
So you sent me this question, and I was thinking. I immediately came up with four, and I'm going to
Sweet.
try to. I'll give you four, and then try to distill it down to the three. So my four, incredibly simple and basic, and I'm a huge fan of basic and old school when possible. Uh, improved or accentuated by new school or technology when it's warranted. But my four staples would be a really well designed warm up. We're going to squat heavy. We're going to sprint with following appropriate guidelines. And then my fourth one, which I maybe would cut out because I could kind of cluster it under the sprint or warm up category, might be plyometrics. So those four are going to be ever present in every single one of my programs. I don't really know any athlete group, team sports, individual sports where we're not doing those things. Now, the warm up is obviously going to be specific to the task or to the sport. Squat heavy might mean different things for different athletes, but pretty much everybody's going to do some form of a squat reasonably heavy at some point in the year, and in many cases for most of the year. Sprinting is something that I do with all of my athletes. We've got a very high level swim group here. We train a lot of volleyball players. So even individuals that don't need to sprint in their sport will still sprint in their training. And then plyometrics is like a no brainer. As I said, I could kind of 2-for-1 that within plyometrics or within the sprinting, because it's, kind of a similar neuromuscular task. And, you could maybe, if I had to throw one out, it might be the plyometrics. But if you give me those first three or all four, I think you could make a hell of an athlete. It doesn't matter what sport, it doesn't matter the age, it doesn't matter the injury history. You can just play around with the details. Because what are we really speaking about here? One, the warm up is not only an opportunity to raise core body temperature and enhance mobility, which is what everybody attributes it to, but is also an opportunity to check boxes for physical capacities that might otherwise be neglected in the training protocol. I work in a team sport environment as well as individual sport. And in the team sport environment, I have these athletes to warm them up 5 times, 6 times a week, 5 or 6 times a week, an average of 10 minutes per day. That's, an hour per week. We train for 48 weeks of the year, or at least 44, depending on when we start the preseason and go through off season. So let's say 45 weeks of the year, an hour per time, an hour total just on the warm up in the course of a week. There's no coach on our staff that solely has responsibility for these athletes more than that. And if we look at my track and field athletes, they might warm up for 40 to 50 minutes in a given session. So we're talking about something that can be very impactful. We can address a lot of different things, whether that's injury prevention or activation or potentiation or hitting little things in small micro doses in a very unobtrusive manner that fits both the objective of the warm-up, but also allowing us to achieve what we want within the session, or maybe making sure that we don't neglect physical capacities or asymmetries or that kind of thing. What is squat heavy? it's basically just a proxy for get crazy strong in the lower extremity. Um, I know it's somewhat gone out of fashion to get, to put all your eggs in the strength basket. And, I've kind of, uh, I guess, brought down my level of importance on it. But I think the evidence is really clear. You got to be pretty strong. You don't have to be squatting 3 times body weight, but you got to be, if you're a male, you got to be squatting 1.6 times your body weight through a full range of motion with good technical execution. If you're a female, it's got to be somewhere around 1.2. And those are, I'd say, the bare minimums. If you're not doing that, regardless of your sport, you're probably, with maybe the exception of swimming, you're probably leaving something on the table in terms of your power development, in terms of your injury history. If you really prefer another exercise, that's fine with me. I'm not really dogmatic about it, but squats are a nice, efficient way of addressing all of the musculature in the lower extremity in a very time efficient manner. You don't have to do 2 sides, you don't have to do different isolation exercises, etc. And then sprinting is probably the single most relevant performance training that you could do for all ground-based athletes. Even for those that don't sprint in their sport, I think there's a lot of uh, transfer of training effect. There's a lot of benefit. In terms of injury reduction, in terms of the neuromuscular adaptations from sprinting on other tasks like jumping and change of direction, um, running economy if you're a distance or endurance type of an athlete. So sprinting is just, a great uh, all around tool. It's your Swiss Army knife in terms of training because it can do so much in terms of its development. And then plyometrics, I think I don't need to speak too much on that, but uh, plyometrics are a fantastic means of bridging the gap between your gym work and your speed power work. You can do them in so many different ways. They're really versatile. So regardless of whether you're lateral sport athlete or a vertical jumper, or you're a swimmer or whatever, plyometrics are just hugely beneficial for creating resiliency, tendon resiliency, explosive power, et cetera. So those are pretty much going to find their way into every training program that I have. Um, I can't think of an example where we're not going to warm up well, we're not going to squat reasonably heavy, we're not going to sprint, and we're not going to do some form of plyometric on a very regular and frequent basis.
You must have read my mind because a recent fascination of mine has been how strong is strong enough. And admittedly, having a variety of biases. One, a majority of my coaching career, 3+ years being at TC Boost, a speed and sprint kind of focused private facility where, maybe 90% of my sessions were turf only. Like we didn't even lift that much. Or if it was our NFL combine guys, like the priority was just fine tune some of those things. They'd been lifting in college for, 4 or 5 years. And even our college kids over the summer, if I saw them for over 12 weeks, like that was impressive, right? And this last year at Northwestern, I had some freshman baseball players squatting 450 plus and then 5 plates plus little 2.5 safety squat. It was over 500 pounds. I was like, all right, these guys should not be on the freshman program, right? So I had this
Right.
light bulb of like, oh, just to assume because they're college males and they've been training. I definitely had some athletes that weren't, but on the flip side, I had freshmen that were the strongest. They jumped 5'8", and they were my best athletes, right? And Matt Ray has this article on his LinkedIn, which you can do that. You can post articles specifically to LinkedIn. I've talked about this article before, but he had a regression of basically squat improvements versus speed improvements and after 1.7. So that's his number. So let's say someone is quote unquote strong enough, then my interpretation would be, all right, let's train max power for 3 weeks, 60 to 80% ish, and then let's touch our max strength once every 4. So like when is that um point where like max strength is on the back the double back burner, so when does it reach that point of strong enough, kind of no questions asked, versus like you're strong enough for now, but a little bit more is not going to hurt, but like it's not our main focus.
I think it depends a little bit on the sport. I mean, I've got some track and field athletes, and in my track and field group over the past couple of years, the group has averaged in size about 8 individuals, mostly males, occasional females, but I'll give you numbers in males since that's what you're already quoted. My average track and field athlete in my group, they squat about 2.45 times body weight, full range, a true
Jeez.
1RM, not estimated. Now that number is pulled up a little bit by one freak of nature who squatted about 3.15 full range, high level long jumper. But the bulk of them are all above 2.1, something like that. Now, where does it matter? It matters in terms of early phase acceleration. So I think there's a really clear benefit out to around 20 meters or so. If you're starting from a static position, with just getting your squat up to around that 2 times body weight load for males, or slightly exceeding it. At around 2.2, you will see that there is a pretty big drop off. But the difference, there's 2 or 3 studies out there which have indicated that the difference you'll still see improvements, but if you go from 2 to 2.2 times body weight on a barbell back squat. Now, if you're a soccer player, does that make a difference? Probably not. But if you're in a sport where everything matters, where the dividing line between success and failure is, hundreds, thousandths of a second, yeah, it matters. So why are we leaving things on the table? And can you get insanely fast without that? Yes, you can. Would Usain Bolt have been fast? Would I make Usain Bolt, try to squat at 24 years of age? No, I wouldn't. But if I had him from when he was 16, I might try to make him squat and get his squat up to a reasonably high level. And a lot of people like to throw around the examples of people who have done it, whether that's your Carl Lewis or Usain Bolt or somebody that is really fast and doesn't have great weight room numbers, or maybe some NFL guy that's not squatting right now. And there's always going to be exceptions to the rules. And I think I tend to look at the body of athletes out there as a whole, and I think there's more sprinters, especially those who are really great accelerators, who have a really strong lower extremity. Whether that their movement of choice might be a deadlift, it might be a squat, but they're doing traditional old school barbell strength work. So I told you the minimums 1.6, 1.2. My soccer team, all women, they're all squatting well above the 1.2, 30 deep. My track and field guys are the other end of the extreme, average of about 2.4 times body weight squat. Did the women get insanely faster, or do they benefit from spending the time to get to 1.8? Probably not too much. It's probably better off spent doing other things. But we try to get to the minimum at the very least, and then then we can take the foot off the gas a little bit.
And until you're training an entire team of Usain Bolts, probably just get your squat up, basically. Fantastic. So that was our first question, again, brought to you by 1080 Motion, here to make speed happen. So next, similar-ish kind of question. But what is one thing in your training that you have been pleasantly surprised, looking back, that it's like stuck around this long? And then one thing that kind of let you down, or the juice wasn't worth the squeeze, that like you had some high hopes for, but quickly made an exit stage left from your programming?
A great question. I'm always trying to audit my own training protocols and kind of what I espouse and teach and advocate for, and see, I'm really hyper aware of being wrong and trying not to be that old guy that is talking about stuff from 20 years ago that's since been disproven. So I'm going to bundle these ones again. My first one is the role of eccentric training. So I was, one of the early adopters of what's now become AEL, or accentuated eccentric loading. And I think we had the first K-box in the US. And I used to play around with a lot of tools and different training methodology. And I think people are starting to realize how beneficial this is. And now we're starting to see more kinetic force profiling of things like repeated jumps and sprinting and changing direction and seeing that, hey, just as we talked about, concentric strength work being important, we also see from this kinetic profiling that a lot of what we need to do is raise the eccentric capacities of the athlete. So I think people are starting to realize that, and along that same lines, the whole movement of isometric training and maybe overloaded eccentric training using tools like flywheel devices and weight releasers, and now some of the mechanical devices out there that can digitally accelerate or accentuate the eccentric phase are great. I know 1080 has something like that as well. So, we have our handful of tools like that. I'm really glad that my early thoughts on that, which were, I was kind of clued into this on a friend in track and field, Dave Kieran, who was a high jump coordinator. He kind of like told me to look at it, and I was kind of he made a compelling argument, and I kind of dove in head first and really started to look at all the research. And this is probably like 15 plus years ago, and really started to do some pretty crazy things in terms of that. Now, as I said, I'm going to bundle this because one of my progressions that I used to use quite frequently with eccentric loading was slower sub-maximal eccentric training. We would go reasonably heavy on these types of activities, around 85%. We might start a progression at 75% of 1RM, 80%, 85%, and do controlled eccentrics. So maybe on a 3 count or a 4 count. And I think the current research literature actually suggests that's probably not all that useful. At the very least, you need to get up to be pretty high. So I used to do entire blocks of controlled eccentric descents, like effectively tempo training, where we're descending on a 3 count or 5 count with moderate loads, multiple reps, maybe 5 reps on a 3 count, that kind of thing, with 80%, 75, 80%. I will still do it now, but in a much less importance, probably about 20% of the total time and volume that I used to spend on it. And I think what the research is showing is that we probably don't reach, unless you get up to really high loads on that, we probably don't reach stimulus threshold to get the types of adaptations that you might want for eccentric capacities, especially fast eccentric capacities, by doing sub-maximal loads at slower tempos. So now I do more and more fast overloaded eccentrics, exceeding 1RM or an athlete's individual to concentrically overcome it, especially with my track and field athletes, or even some of my basketball players. We're doing it very regularly, doing it, almost displace some of that slow volume with an early progression to this faster, more aggressively overloading eccentric volume. So 2 for 1 there. I've kind of not fully discarded the slow sub-maximal eccentric, but I place much less of a premium on it in terms of my progression. Might have a benefit in terms of tendon resiliency and maybe work capacity, but it's probably not situated in terms of in the progression in a way that it used to be for me. I used to think, hey, it makes sense to let's just increase the load in this controlled manner. But it really is it's too sub-maximal to really make a dent in terms of what I'm looking to train.
If someone doesn't have a K-box or flywheel or the weight releasers, what are some of your go-to ways, whether it's like weighted plyometrics or depth landings or banded, squat drop catches, pause at the bottom, like different ways without, some of the higher end equipment and stuff to get that like fast eccentric overload, probably for let's just say like an average facility.
Yeah. So here's an interesting story is that I think the reason I have a K-box in the first place is because Eccentric, the company, saw some presentations I was doing with just what you're asking for. So I was doing a handful of different things, getting creative, using a strong weak methodology, meaning you do a strong lift on the concentric phase and a weaker lift on the eccentric phase. And by so doing, you can overload the weaker lift because the load exceeds the capacity of the eccentric lift. So, for
Well, what?
example, if you
Yeah, an
were to do
example.
a deadlift, uh, a deadlift on the concentric, and then you do an RDL with that same weight on the eccentric.
Okay,
Uh,
like a two up, one down kind of thing.
well, yeah, two up, one down is a variation of it. So that's kind of a strong weak as well. So if you were to say push up with two and then lower on just one limb, that's a great example of, and a very safe example of a overloaded eccentric. And you can go reasonably heavy because you're not spinal loading to any great degree. Um, you can do partner assisted, that such as pushing, having a partner push down, or machine pull or something like that. That's really hard to quantify that, so I kind of moved away from that. Some of the more dangerous and maybe stupid things I was doing was, doing loading up the barbell without weight releasers. I think we once got up to 135% of a 1RM, lowered it down to pins, um, and lowered it slowly. And it, of course, at 135% of 1RM, it turns into a very fast eccentric. You almost reach a fail point where the muscles just kind of give out on you. Um, but those were the kinds of things I was doing. Now you don't have to go to 135%. I think you can get to like 105 or restrict the range or something like that, or do some of those safer methods of two up, one down, or strong weak, or a lot of machine lifts lend themselves really well to overloaded eccentric to do it really safely. And I know a lot of people don't have machines, but if your standard leg press would be a great example. Super easy to overload eccentric. You on that pin squat, or that pin squat one that I was saying, where we'd go to 135, is a pain in the butt. You got to unload the weights at the bottom, and then somebody's got to pick it back up, and you just done one rep. So weight releasers are reasonably cheap right now. You can find them for, I want to say, under $100. We've got a couple sets of them at Athletic Lab. They're a nice tool to use if you don't have access to some of the more high tech versions, and even if you don't want to get the weight releasers, strong weak method, two up, one down method. I will plyometrics. Is a very fast way of doing the training eccentric overload. We do a lot of box catches with my track and field athlete, or box fall from a height and just a small rebound out of it. The past 3 years, we have been using that pretty extensively and progressing the height of the fall as a means of overload. So I think that's a great tool. It's not just like, hey, we're going to progress in terms of volume. We're going to start at, we're going to start at a 1 meter fall, 39 inches or so. For a lot of people, that's like huge. So these are elite level track and field athletes. 39 inches. We progress it by about 5 centimeters every 2 weeks or so, about 2 inches. So sooner or later, we're up at 45-inch, 50-inch drop, just literally step off the plank onto the ground and maybe a small rebound out of it. Not really trying to jump, but just a massive eccentric overload. A couple guys got up even a little bit higher than that. So not something you have to play around with that level of extreme overload, but handful of examples there where you don't need any fancy equipment. That does make it easier, simpler sometimes. It makes it certainly easier to quantify it. But you got a lot of options at your disposal, even if you just wanted to go low tech, low budget.
So all it takes is some creativity for sure. And to summarize, kind of in your opinion, to get the most benefits out of eccentric kind of focused training is to get in that super maximal, kind of above 100% threshold, as opposed to more sub-maximal eccentrics. Very, very cool. So consequently, as a big piece of what you do on top of the coaching is sports science, integrating sports science in your coaching, or all of the offerings that you have at Athletic Lab with all the tech and stuff. What is one piece of technology that has stuck around, and then one piece of technology that you were super hopeful for, that when you actually got your hands on the data and using it, you're like, oh man, this isn't gonna be that good?
The first one I'd say is force platforms. I was before I started Athletic Lab, I was the lab director, biomechanics lab director at LSU. And we had force platforms and 3D motion analysis. And I remember having to take care of that stuff, and it was so cumbersome. These force platforms are big and they're heavy and they're not wireless. And you've got to know how to code to deal with the data and the startup times for just getting the computer and the platforms to work and calibrating them and making sure the floor is level and flat and without compression. It was just unbelievably cumbersome to get this data and incredibly expensive as well. And now we've got force platforms that are, very close to that same quality of data, if not exceeding it in some ways. But the data is really accessible and it's easy to use. So I've been a user of force platforms for over 20 years, from when they were really just accessible in academic labs. And now we've got a couple sets at Athletic Lab. We use them very regularly across multiple different demographics for multiple different uses, whether that's a strength assessment or reactive strength assessment, asymmetries from returning from injury, kind of readiness assessments. And I'm all in on it, really. I do think there's a lot of benefit there to looking at the actual kinetics. I think, we coach with our eyes, but you can't oftentimes see the forces. You just see the results of those forces. So actually having some insight in terms of the forces has been very useful, and having data that is really easily accessible and actionable. And I can teach my interns how to use a force platform in 5 minutes. They might not know how to extrapolate all the data and understand it all, but as opposed to me having to be at the biomechanics lab 45 minutes in advance of a data collection and make sure everything is all set up. Now I could teach a total newbie in 5 minutes. It's on an iPad. There's no wires. It's all Bluetooth. It's just incredibly approachable now, and very user friendly. So great stuff there. In terms of some tech or sports science that I don't quite think has met the initial promise, I'd say sprint force velocity profiling.
Interesting.
And I was very hopeful for this. I thought, I actually worked with what was Smartabase at the time, or Smart Speed at the time, to kind of look at their beta test their FVP, force velocity profiling, using timing gates to get 10-meter splits and thinking that it would have a lot of value. And I really don't think that I don't think it has much value at all. I think there's some potential benefit for force velocity profiling on jumping, but for sprinting, I think it's not very valuable, not at all actionable. I think there's a lot of issues with it, at least in terms of using it for with sprint splits. Now, if you were to get force velocity profiling from say a 1080, a tethered device, the results might be different. But I know that most of the attempts to FVP sprinting are not really worthwhile at all. You're not going to get much information out of it, and I think using the times for splits on to force velocity profile is kind of like trying to assess the power of a vehicle by listening to its engine, or maybe better off its muffler, right? It used to be you could hear the muffler growl and you go, oh, that's a muscle car and that's got to be pretty freaking fast. But now that's like a correlation. It's not a causation. So I think that we're just looking at the wrong thing by taking splits and trying to force velocity profile. There's too many things in between the actual result, which is the split, and the force that is being produced. Of course, there's the Newtonian laws don't lie. I mean, the Newtonian mechanics don't lie, but I was really hopeful for it. I don't think there's a lot of benefit to doing any FVP. It's kind of sounds great, but there's not a lot of actionable use in it.
Yeah, there's just so many things that have to go into getting a sprint correct, from the mechanics and the timing and also just the state of the athlete that day, versus on the flip side, what I argued in a recent kind of series of Patreon posts is like the the simplicity of a counter movement jump on a force plate makes it so reliable and it's so simple. Um, and similarly, this past year at Northwestern, having high level athletes for however many weeks it was, jumping, 2 to 3 times a week. I really enjoyed kind of using those as one of my main methods, plus some lifting numbers to kind of make my decision tree for individualization. So, what are some of your top 3 to 5 metrics ish that you use from a counter movement jump to help you kind of get insights into an athlete's ability, what you want to do with them, how you evaluate progress besides just jumping higher, and kind of basically what do you look at besides jump height?
So we've actually moved increasingly away from jump height as like a key metric, especially how we use it. So athletes, that's of course the number that they care about the most, so that they relate to the most.
Mhm.
But we found that it's not super valuable in terms of what we are jump testing the athletes for. We use RSI jump catalog of tests to, I think that's more relevant for most athletic performance movements. But for when we do a counter movement jump, we're looking at, of course, symmetry. We actually started counter movement jumping the team that I work with once a week, all season long. And part of the reason we do it is so that we always have um, baseline numbers that are recent for if someone should ever get hurt or uh, have to take some time off. We have very recent force profile of that individual. But in terms of the actual metrics we're looking at, I would say time to peak eccentric force, time to peak concentric force, uh, the peak velocity, how long are they loading for? Those are probably the big ones that we're looking at. There's obviously dozens of them, but now our our key metrics tend to be less about the actual performance itself, because that athletes can achieve that with multiple different strategies, but more so with how they're doing it. And what we found is, especially time to peak eccentric force has been very useful for us. A friend of mine, Matt Jordan, has kind of pointed me in the right direction a dozen different times, and he's looked at a handful of different things, and that's one of the ones he's recommended me looking at is a lot of the temporal parameters and not just the performance metrics. So uh, getting a little bit more insight into terms of how they're actually achieving the performance rather than just the actual outcome itself.
Yeah, I describe RSI mod as like just what you put into it versus what you get out of it. Takeoff velocity versus time to take off. But a theme that kind of just my brain clicked as you were describing those numbers was the temporal or the time theme. And that's the most unique constraint of sports, is like get to the finish line before someone else, get to the ball before someone else does, versus like you can grind out a squat, for 9 seconds as long as you finish the squat. So interesting kind of spin on looking at those metrics, mostly with the time component. And I do remember reading about your LSU. I know that I miss a lot of things about your background, but something that you also did was be a track coach at LSU and worked with Boo Schexnayder. And just listening to him on a few podcasts, I learned a lot. So I can't imagine actually working with the guy. So having coached with Boo Schexnayder, what was that like, first off? And second, kind of what are one or two of kind of the biggest things that you do now that you attribute to your time with him, or the biggest things that you learned from him?
Oh, so Boo and I are still quite close. I get to speak with him in Brazil in a week or so time, and he's like he's him, Dan Paff, maybe Tom Telez are the father of my coaching family tree. But with Boo being under those guys or adjacent to those guys, and very similar philosophy, and the one who's single-handedly most influential for me. So Interesting story. I actually go to LSU, or I applied to all these big time track and field programs thinking that I'm going to coach sprints. That's a sexy event. Speed is where it's at. I applied to like your University of Florida, UCLA, LSU, you name it, all the big top 10 schools. No one basically writes me back to kind of be a volunteer assistant or a graduate assistant. I end up speaking at the Ohio Track and Field High School Coaches Conference, which is huge. There's like 800 people that attend the thing. And Boo happened to be there. Now, Boo was the jumps coach. Boo, I think, sat in on my talk. I ended up speaking to him afterwards. I asked him about, hey, what's the deal? Can I come down here and coach sprints? He's like, oh, don't worry about that. Come work for me. So I like ecstatic about this. I do my doctoral program work for in biomechanics, being a lab director there. And at the same time, I'm kind of juggling being out at the track for 4 hours every day for 4 years. Now, here I am. I went to a little tiny school in New York State, not great at track and field at all. I was kind of a, Division I athlete, but about as humble Division I of athlete as you can be. Transferred to Ohio University, a mid-major, kind of smaller type school. They were okay at track and field, but then I go to LSU, and my first day on the track, I'm seeing Olympic legends, people that have been on the cover of Track and Field News, people that are wearing their national team uniforms out to practice, seeing people that I've heard about, but couldn't imagine ever meeting. And, it was everything that you can imagine in terms of a learning experience. I would bring a notebook out to the track every day, or make mental notes and then go back to my office and jot them down. Things that Boo wrote verbatim, I would write them down. Oftentimes kind of very informal sayings or almost funny type of things that he would say, or the ways that he would handle or relate to different athletes. It was incredibly eye-opening to me in terms of my entire coaching philosophy is really just an adaptation of what I learned from Boo, with some Dan Paff and Tom Telez sprinkled in. Also worked with a guy named Ethan Reeve, who was I was a GA for him in terms of strength development. I was a strength and conditioning coach, graduate assistant for Ethan Reeve, who became the Collegiate Strength and Conditioning Coaches Association president and is kind of a legend in his own right. Worked for him. So one of the things that I saw between those two was the synergy in the strength training was actually really interesting and validating. You had a guy who came from two guys who came from totally different backgrounds. But I'd say if I were to distill my learning experience from Boo or time at LSU into one thing, it was standards. So the standards were upheld regardless of what we were talking about. If it was a stretch, we did it a certain way. If it was a sprint drill, the details mattered. If we were doing a little baby bounds in the grass for a cool down, barefoot, the way we did it mattered. The fact that you took off your shoes every single time mattered. The way that we run the stadium stairs mattered. There was nothing that was sloppy. There was nothing that was half-assed. Everything mattered. And I hinted at this earlier, but I think what I have later come to realize is that in a sport like track and field, where you regularly have athletes win by, incredibly small margins, centimeter, hundredths of a second, that kind of thing. Some cases less than that, right? We saw in the 100-meter final this past Olympic finals that you have athletes winning by less than a hundredth of a second. You run 100 meters and you win by an almost immeasurable amount. So what matters? And I later kind of come to the realization that everything matters. If you're dealing with margins that small, everything matters. How you do the warm-up matters. How you, contact the ground matters. All these seemingly insignificant things matter. And so when I say standards, I mean it very broadly, but I also mean we've got to, if we're really looking to try to turn over every stone, for performance, you can't, you first got to get the big things right, but don't overlook the small things either. I see people do their sprint drills and they look like crap all the time, or their warm-ups, and my athletes aren't immune to that either. I won't say that they all do everything perfectly, but it was very eye-opening for me to see, like, hey, you want to become a champion, there's a pathway, there's no secret to this success. You can see the people that are doing this well and at a high level, and they're being held to account, and there's standards, and it matters. And it was very, kind of eye-opening to see, like, no one was bigger than the system. If you're not going to get on board with this system, we're gonna get rid of you. We're gonna run you off, or we're not going to bring you to the meet. And being from a small school or a mid-major school, this was like, holy crap, you're gonna kick this national champion out of practice because they didn't warm up right. I was like, and then you later see, like, yeah, we're gonna kick them out of practice, and if they don't get on board, we're gonna continue on without them. We're gonna continue to be successful without this person. And if they want to get on board and be a part of this system, then they're going to have a similar level of success to all these people that have come before them. And so kind of seeing what it takes, like true high performance, was really, really eye-opening. I thought I knew, but I had no idea.
Fantastic. What a legendary intro story. Again, people coming back around. And yeah, like I just made that connection, and from as a fan, I've learned a lot from him. So just crazy, crazy small world again. And then last two questions here, home stretch. So having spent time as a track specific coach and also a track S&C coach, apart from just like kind of poo-pooing the Olympic team sport world of just like, oh, they're just meatheads, or they don't know how to train, or kind of all these things. But then on the flip side, like, not everyone is going to do just sprint workouts for like 3 hours at a time. So track athletes are the fastest in the world, obviously. So what does team sport S&C get wrong that we can learn from the track world, besides just like, oh, you have to improve your mechanics and you have to sprint with this kind of frequency? So above the basics of mechanics, frequency, good programming, kind of things like that, what can team sport S&C take away from track S&C?
I think what I would say is that a lot of times you see, even especially in the past 5 or 10 years, and this is due in large part to people like myself and all the Altus crew kind of venturing outside of the world of track and field into team sports, and kind of making this information a little bit more accessible and publicly available. One of the things that I have seen where things go wrong is that your team S&C coaches oftentimes look at what track and field coaches are doing now, which is great, and they're seeing what they're doing in the weight room, which is great, but they're not looking at the entire program. And what they oftentimes do is look at the things that look different or unique, or maybe a little bit more sexy, and losing sight of the fact that in track and field, you train the physical aspect of performance, depending on your event, somewhere between 15 and 20 hours a week. That's like just the physical performance. You got to layer on the technical stuff in there as well, if you're going at the elite level, or maybe even the high level Division I competitor. So you got a lot of time and control over all aspects of the training, right? So doing things like, some of these lower intensity activities, and maybe some remedial exercises, and what sometimes coaches refer to as general strength, or medicine ball circuits, or all of these different plyometrics and the varying progressions. They lose sight of the fact that we can do those things in track and field. We can do all those things in track and field because we have the time and the control to do all of those things. In team sport settings, in contrast, you might have as little as 45 minutes in a week to be in the gym.
Crazy.
Right? And if you're lucky, if you're lucky, maybe 3 to 4 hours a week in the gym or warm up. And I mean, that's like insane amount of time for the performance coach to work in a team sports setting. So the mistake I would say is looking at this program that is literally aimed at turning over every rock, right? No stone unturned. We're going to search for that last 0.01 of a second, that last centimeter. Uh, we're going to do everything that we can. The point of diminishing returns in a sport of track and field means absolutely nothing. Diminishing returns, you just blow straight through it. 1.6 times body weight squat, not even close to good enough, right? If we see gains to 2 times body weight squat, we got to pursue that, right? Diminishing returns means nothing in a sport like track and field or swimming or cycling or Olympic weightlifting. You are going for every last minutia of performance. That's not the case in team sport. You are being pulled in many different directions. So you got to look and see, yes, we get the programming right, but also figure out what matters most. Take what I'd call like a burning house or deserted island approach. If your house is burning down and you've only got a minute to grab a couple things, what are you grabbing? You're not grabbing the roll of toilet paper. You're not going to grab the kitchen knives. You're probably going to grab things like, hey, maybe my laptop's really important. Maybe those pictures, maybe that lock of my child's hair, whatever it is. Everybody has something different, but you're going to distill it down really quickly to the 2 or 3 or 4 most important elements of training, or things that you want to save. And I think that's where a lot of team sport coaches miss out. They're still not doing the big rocks really well. You have that 3 hours of training per week where you just can develop their physical capacities, and you're spending 45 minutes of it with bands around the ankles doing activation work. Waste of time. That's like going and picking up the toilet paper roll out of your burning house. Turn over the things that are most impactful. So find that hierarchy. Track and field, there's a lot of lessons to learn there, but make sure that you're looking at the commonalities in programming. What do they do? It actually looks a heck of a lot like what I opened with. Is might not be heavy squat, but they're warming up really well in a very extensive, exhaustive, not exhausting, but exhaustive, comprehensive, holistic warm up that are training different physical capacities. They are sprinting with regularity, frequency, intensity, appropriate rest. And they're doing some kind of plyometrics with regularity. I mean, people know that, but they don't do it. They don't do it as much as they say they know they do it. I see a lot of this kind of low end stuff that is just, at least in my opinion, doesn't have a place in the burning house scenario.
And done at a standard high enough to, when you race at
Right.
a 100th margin, and it's crazy just hearing you kind of talk through just the mindset of like, we have 20 hours a week of lifting and track to specifically sprint faster versus like, I had three lifts plus like speed school, let's just say an hour. So I had 4 hours a week to work on one thing that's like part of their sport,
Right. Yeah.
just getting faster. So, but on the flip side, like when you're looking at those, like I'm just trying to get my athletes healthy, running better, and like in a spot to practice more and better versus like in the track world, obviously it's gone for hundredths of a second. So very, very cool. So last question here. So coach education and your coach academy, which I briefly scrolled through, very impressive. And just having my own little content and my Patreon and my YouTube and just trying to put together some guides and ebooks and stuff. Like I know that creating coach education is no task for the faint of heart, as I know you'll always succeed. It's just a matter of when. Look at how we brought this full circle. But where has coach education, fit into your career, your journey, you leading a staff? And could you take us kind of through the idea, thought process, and kind of turn this coaching academy into life?
Sure. So I have been a product of coaching education. I had a great mentor in Coach Ethan Reeve, who kind of took me under his wing, pointed me in the right direction. I was always reading a lot of material from very, very young age and kind of super invested in really diving into sports science, training theory, and the Russian literature from very, very young age as an athlete. But then Coach Reeve kind of pointed me in the right direction in some things. And then I later worked with Boo, who was a legend in coaching education in the USA track and field and later USTF CCCA curriculum. And so if you go to USA track and field circles or any, collegiate pro high school circles, Boo's a legend in terms of not just his coaching. What he's achieved in coaching is phenomenal, but in terms of what he shared. Now, there are coaches that maybe have achieved what he has achieved as a coach, but in terms of sharing that information, he stands alone. And for me, going with him for 4 years and him just opening the doors and letting me learn so much, and then seeing how well he taught. And it wasn't just he had this content. He had this content, but he was really willing to share it, and he made it so easy and approachable to learn. So it wasn't just like, you see people talk about this information and they might as well be speaking a different language, and they're maybe trying to impress you with how much they know. Boo was always the exact opposite. And you could tell really quickly that he had such a high level of mastery because he could simplify even the most complex topics. And here I am going to get my PhD in biomechanics, and Boo is a track coach, a well-educated track coach, but he's teaching me things about biomechanics. And I really quickly saw like, oh, wow, this is what I'm aspiring to, is to share this information. And I think as I've grown older, you start to see like, what makes humans special. And I think it comes down to the fact that we share information and we pass on information. That's how our societies are built. That's how cultures are built. That's how we have iPhones and computers and build skyscrapers, is not because we're smarter than people that lived 2,000 years ago, but because we built on what they have passed down to us. And I almost saw it as a thing where, hey, I've had these great mentors. Dan Paff was taking a lot of time out to kind of just send me emails and, recommend jobs for me and things like that and educate me. And I had these great mentors, Boo and Dan and Ethan Reeve. And it was like, how can I pay this forward? How can I be a part of this as well? And I really quickly saw that you can be so much more impactful if you have this great information that's worth sharing, if you actually share it. If we have this conversation, or if I'm working with 20 athletes, I'm sharing my information with those 20 athletes. But if I share that information with a coach, now that coach can work with 20 athletes, and maybe those athletes become coaches later on. So it has this, multiplier effect, this force multiplier. If you share the information that has been passed on to you, and maybe build on it if you can, but you share that information to others who don't retain it, but they're willing to share it, that's where you can make a real difference, a real impact. And in today's world, I think the information is more easily accessible than ever. We can hop on any social media network or YouTube and find every exercise under the sun and every training philosophy. But it becomes harder and harder to distill what is actually relevant and important and trustworthy. And I think that's where, being critical minded and having great mentors and seeing who's actually done it and not just putting something up flashy on the Instagram or TikTok or whatever is incredibly beneficial and worthwhile, and almost combats the nonsense that is, populates our world. So what I tried to do was like be invested into coaching education as well. I got into USA track and field coaching education, thanks in large part to Boo and a couple others. I've taught coaching ed for USA weightlifting and USA speed skating and US track and field cross country coaches association and the strength and conditioning national governing bodies in the US and the UK and Australia. And it's kind of a passion of mine to share what I've learned because of this force multiplier effect. We were tasked with starting an internship kind of a couple years back, maybe 12, 15 years back. This basically was me just standing up and lecturing to this group of people that would tell me what they wanted to hear about for the day. And became more and more formal as the years went on. A group in Brazil picked up the fact that we were doing this, and they asked if we could turn it into a course. We later did. This became our coaching academy. We recorded videos for it, so it's online, it's in person. We have a 3-phase course now. It's kind of modeled after the best practices of what I learned in USA Track and Field, and from Boo, and from Dan, and from my own history and education, both as a professor as well as a student. So now we have this coaching academy. It's available all online, but also we deliver the courses. I think we're at 9 countries and probably a couple thousand people around the world that have been a part of it. I'm not going to stand up here and say it's the absolute best, but I'm going to say it's the best that we know right now. And that's what we try to hold ourselves to, is that we're incredibly open-minded and critical-minded, and that combination of things will lead us to an open source product that we feel very proud to stand behind, that is evidence-based and field proven, and is not the body that represents Mike Young, but is the body that represents everybody that I have studied and mentored under, and feel very confident that it is a strong, if not the right way of doing things in many regards to physical development.
Fantastic. So not only a knockdown coach, but a knockdown educator as well, giving back to the field. Love it. I'm in the same space too, and it is no undertaking for the faint of heart, like I said, on top of everything else that you got going on. So thank you very much for everything that you do. Thank you for your time today. I'll wrap this up and open up the floor for you to shamelessly plug, emphasis on shameless. Where can the listeners get more of you, the Coach Academy, maybe some of your talks, if you have like a YouTube channel, or basically with all the knowledge bombs that we dropped in just an hour, where can the listeners get more of Coach Mike Young?
So I'm semi-active on Instagram at Mike Young PhD. As well as LinkedIn. Mike Young is my handle there. I have coaching education efforts that are available online, a lot of which is free and some of which is paid, on the athleticlabacademy.com, as well as LTAD Network, which is a company that I co-founded with, I'm partnered with James Baker, another brilliant mind as well, where we offer a lot of top-notch videos, not only in the LTAD space, but also high performance. We really take a cradle-to-grave approach. So if I put a ton of information out there, I'd probably say most of my paid lectures are also available if you search hard enough for free. I don't try to gatekeep too much in terms of that, because I do think the information is, if it's worth spreading, that it's worth making accessible. But try to share as much as I can within reason, of course. But thank you for the opportunity, Matt.
Yeah. So those will all be in the show notes below, and feel free to give Mike a follow, as I've definitely reaped the benefits, and hopefully the listener will as well. So thank you very much again for your time, and hopefully we will be talking again soon.